Hey, there we go. Awesome. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Now I can share my screen too. We're rolling. We got this. All right. Let me know if everyone can see. Just need someone in the chat box, I guess. All right. Cool. Yes, thank you for the rousing introduction, everyone, and I'm glad you're here. And I hope you learned a thing or two and your ears weren't bleeding when Mark Gruber was done. It's okay. I can make fun of him because we work together, so it's okay. But anyways, so I'm glad you're here, and we'll get right into it. I don't think this will fill the full class time without stopping, if I'd ever stop for questions. So I'm only saying that to say when we do stop for questions, feel free to it's okay if we get into a little bit of conversation, because that's how we'll kind of hopefully bring this stuff together. So as Mark and Meredith said, I'm the community forester with the Department of Conservation. I like to help out at Forest Relief, and I'm on the board now. It's really cool. But the bottom line is, as Mark said, once you get into this stuff, you become a tree nerd for life. So I appreciate everyone being here. When you get going with the ID and you just want to get it right. So with that being said, kind of what we're going to go through tonight is not going to be looking at pictures of trees and trying to just identify every tree and memorize it, especially because we're not able to meet outside and look at a tree with our faces up close and with our hands and touch and feel. So what we're going to go through tonight are just some points and a methodology. I hope to leave you tonight with not walking out to a tree and knowing by memory, oh, that's a red bud because it has heart-shaped leaves, but being able to stand up next to a tree and go through a thought process and end up at, oh, you know what, I'm pretty sure that's a red bud because of X, Y, and Z that we'll talk about. So we'll go through how plants are classified. We'll talk about what a scientific name is, and especially if you become involved with the nursery, you'll realize why that becomes important. And we'll talk about the characteristics that you can use to identify trees, using our senses. And then we'll hopefully get down into the minutia of the actual makeup of leaves and twig structure and how that can help, and the bark coloration and the bark structure. And hopefully that again ties in some of the biology that you learned last class. Like I said, this is just a how-to, not exactly, looking at photos, and highly recommend. There's some different continuing education type things around town every now and then. I'm not sure how often it opens up to just the public, but there's continuing education at St. Louis Community College, and there's also a professional around town with the name of Dan Billman, and he does these wonderful walkabouts in the spring and in the winter. And if you can ever have a chance to be a part of that, it's Dan Billman, Billman, and I know he does it for professionals, and I'm not sure how often, if ever, he does it for just general just folks. But it's worth a chance because it's really another opportunity to talk about what we're going to go through tonight, but yet get up close and really see some different specimens around town that are really neat. These publications from the Department of Conservation are absolutely free, and they're very good. Maybe I'm biased, maybe I'm not, but I think they're pretty good, especially for free at something you can pick up at um, stopping into Powder Valley when it opens back up, and Bush when it opens back up, August A. Bush Memorial Conservation Area. Nonetheless, you can, through our website, you can send away for these and have them mailed to your doorstep. I think we even have some available electronically. But the Missouri Oaks and Hickories especially, it's got color photos of the twigs and of the leaves, and it'll help with some of the different nuts, acorn or hickory nut, and can help you identify that way. We do always caution that, we'll get to it later, but you don't want to use guides as a crutch, right? It can be easy to get too reliant on anything we do with just like rushing to Google or a book and just flipping through and saying, it looks like that. Again, that kind of memorization it doesn't always help us to know why we got there or how we got there. With that in mind, just know that, it's a process, and I like to think of it as like a funnel. When you walk up to a tree or a plant, you're at the top of that funnel. It's very wide because there's a lot of possibilities of what you might be looking at. But the more you run through and check off in our minds what it is not, then you could lower yourself down in that funnel to where eventually you spit out down at the spout, and you've hopefully narrowed it down to one, if not two options. So just take your time, don't rush. And some of the important things that people tend to forget or say, yada, yada, there'll be a tag on it, or I don't need to know if it's, I think it's a maple. Okay. Well, how do we care for these trees in the nursery, out in our yards, anywhere that you're at where someone needs to take care of a plant? How can you do that properly if you don't know what you're looking at? If you don't know that you're looking at a red oak and you're about to make pruning cuts going into a hot, humid time in the spring, if you didn't know that that was a red oak, you could potentially really harm that plant. You could harm that tree, and you could cause it to get oak wilt, which is fatal to the tree. So again, that sounds like an extreme case, but it does happen a lot where even folks that get paid to do this for a living just may show up and start making cuts or doing what they need to do without really paying attention to what the plant is that they're looking at, and knowing that that plant has specific needs. And don't just stop looking at trees when the leaves fall. It's harder. We'll get to it at the very end, but it's really cool to be able to just get proficient enough to walk up to a tree and see the bark and see the branch structure, or in the nursery setting, they're right there at eye level still, leaf off, and kind of be able to identify it. And that's how when you can finally get some winter tree ID down, then you've gotten somewhere, right? So it's cool. It's practice makes perfect, as with anything. And we'll go through again like a little bit of the plant classification system, and just so you can have a background on how plants are named. Hopefully get a little depth on that. Any questions so far? Okay, we'll keep going. So the basics of classifying plants is known as plant taxonomy. And as you get into a lot of scientific things, we go with Latin because you can be pretty specific, and it's kind of known across the industry and across the scientific realm that we've always done a lot of things with Latin. And taxonomy is the study, the description and classification of living organisms. And so it's kind of what we're working in here tonight. And the highest classification, again, starting to make sense of the natural world, because there's so many things to look at. Obviously, you have the different kingdoms. You start at the very top, trying to make sense of the world around us. That's how this all came about. And you have the plant kingdom and the animal kingdom at the very top level, right? I hope that I'm in the right place here and no one expects us to go through the animal kingdom, because you might feel misled. But that's where we start. And I like this photo here at the top. It always reminds me of how different plants can be, even if you are further down in the plant taxonomy. When you get down to a certain species, even then, the genetics of a given plant can be so different. This is at the Missouri State Fair, and it's always fun to stop by and look at the largest plants of any kind. You get to see those 100-pound pumpkins and 80-pound watermelons and fun stuff like that. So we start with kingdom, and then we move down a level. Again, kingdom is, obviously millions of plants in the plant kingdom. So even from the classification funnel of narrowing the list down, it's, still infinite. You walk up to something, well, it's a plant. It's in the plant kingdom. Oh, great. That didn't narrow it down at all. But then you can go down a little further. You have the division or phylum, and we'll stick with the word phylum because I'll share with you a kind of mnemonic device later that can help you to remember this, since you're now going to use it in everyday life, right? But phylum is it's a division underneath kingdom that separates vascular plants, those with xylem and phloem, and those without. So as you talked about in biology, we know trees, shrubs, perennials, we have, we have xylem and phloem that makes up their woody tissue, okay? And that's how you can get down to within the phylum that of plants, you have angiosperms and gymnosperms. I know that we're throwing a lot of jargon here, but just think of it in the realm of angiosperms are trees that have seeds covered by an ovary. Think apple, cherry, all of the seeds of the world that have some sort of coating, covering that allows them to draw nutrients to get that seed to start and germinate. And those are angiosperms, your oaks, hickories. Now, if you think of a tree you might see in everyday life that is a gymnosperm or of naked seed, I think, if you stop to think about what that would mean, is seeds that would just fall to the ground with no coating on them, you can kind of reason out that, okay, we're talking about evergreens or conifers, cone-bearing species. So that's where you can start to separate out. We don't always look at it this way. We don't have Latin on our brains when we walk up to a tree. And it's fairly obvious in the real world. If you walk up to something that has needles in January or is green in January, you'll say, oh, it's a conifer, it's cone-bearing. It's also a gymnosperm, versus seeing that oak tree in the dead of winter that has dropped maybe some acorns on the ground that are all kind of brown and crunchy now because we're in January. That is an angiosperm. So that's the difference between the two. So again, yeah, you can start to narrow that down just a little bit by being a little more specific. Just a little bit more on it. We kind of went over it, but flower angiosperms are also classified as flowering plants, and there's, as with nature, there's exceptions to every rule. And if we were, just going back and forth here in person, I'd throw out: are all evergreens conifers? Are all conifers evergreen? Well, no, because again, nature's fun that way. Likes to throw wrenches at us. Okay, uh, think of the bald cypress tree. Bald cypress is a deciduous conifer. Okay, it is not an evergreen. It has its leaves bear the shape that look like a needle. We kind of sometimes call them needles, but they are the leaves of the tree. They fall off the tree in the fall, but yet the fruit of a bald cypress is a cone. It is a little ball that when you look at it very closely, you'll see it's very compressed. What looks like the little pieces of a pine cone, but they're just all compressed together. So that's an example of how nature can trick us sometimes. But in generalities, this will help you be able to kind of narrow things down a little bit. Below that, you have kingdom, phylum, and then class. And then that's a division where you can, within, say, angiosperms, you move into what are known as dicots, dicotyledons, and monocotyledons. So here we can think in real world terms, almost every tree you've seen is a dicot, in that think of a young sprout of almost any tree, just but that sprout. Think of if you ever germinated an acorn or or a seed in a cup or in a small container, and it comes up with two leaves. usually 2 or multiples of 2, but it sprouts up and you'll have those first 2 leaves, those seed leaves. That is a dicotyledon. And the most common monocot that is dealt with in the tree realm is palms. Palms actually aren't a tree. We won't really get into this too much tonight because we're in Missouri, but it's one of the biggest misconceptions that we hear is, oh, go cut that palm tree, or oh, look at those palm trees. Technically, depending on your definition of a tree, Gruber probably talked about this. Palms aren't trees because they don't have that xylem and phloem, and they don't have that that one. Well, okay, I apologize. Scratch what I said, but they don't have multiples. One seed leaf coming up. They're a monocot versus trees being dicots. Okay, and grasses is another good example. We look at that every day. When you see grass seed sprout and germinate, it just has that one blade that initially comes up. Okay, I hope that that's clear. And then moving forward, so you have now we're down further to where these are the kind of things we use a lot more often in classifying and identifying. Is you get down to order and family. And order and family in plant taxonomy really becomes useful, because then you start making real sense of the living world around us, and you start grouping things by morphological characteristics or growth characteristics, traits that you can compare against each other, that just by looking, touching, feeling, and smelling. And so family just boils that down even further, and you're starting to tease out down into the hundreds, if not sub hundreds of types of things you might see that you can narrow it down. For instance, we like to use this at the bottom. Anyone have a Fabaceae, there's a few different things we can name there, and they vary widely. It can be anything from a honey locust tree, a black locust tree, down to a redbud tree, or soybean, or anything that is a legume. So it's a huge family, but yet within there, obviously, there's some major differences. So that's kind of where we start to get into things we'll use in the real world, our everyday world. Finally, the most common, what you'll see on tags on trees at a nursery, is genus and species, kind of the meat and potatoes of what we like to talk about. And the genus is, that very familiar fundamental, genetic traits that will carry through and just really be prevalent throughout that genus. Okay. Oaks are my favorite, so I always use oaks. But with oaks, you can always count on an acorn, and you can always count on, lobed leaves of some sort. There's always an exception to the rule, but for the most part, you'll always have some sort of lobed leaf to go off of. And so that really can help you with identification. And also the buds in the Quercus genus are just the way that they grow, the way they stack up. They're small cuticles on the bud. It's very no matter the oak, you can see a similarity there when you look very closely. And then species, obviously, trees that have the reproduce and have them very similar offspring. So you get your genus and species is kind of where we really like to identify things with. And here's that mnemonic device I was hoping to get to give you. It's not on the screen, but it plays nicely here with this list. You have kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. You can also think of it as kings play chess on fat gray stumps. So, just something to remember it by. Not like it's going to be on a test or anything. But here is an example, sugar maple. We've seen it. We've all hopefully experienced a tree that looks like this. Good old maple syrup. But the kingdom of sugar maple is Plantae. The phylum Magnoliophyta, and that's the term for angiosperms, which we know it is. And then the class, Magnoliopsida dicotyledons, because when it sprouts, it has 2 leaves, remember. And then the order is Sapindales, and the family Aceraceae, Acer saccharum. So instead of in everyday life, more often than not, if we deal in nursery stock and we deal in taking care of trees, we'll start to use Acer saccharum more often than just walking through the park and saying, there's a nice Acer saccharum over there. It becomes a lot really pertinent, because how many times have you heard a single tree called a different name? It happens fairly often, especially with certain species. There's one I don't have on the screen here, and it's called Osage orange. Well, depending on what part of Missouri you're in or what part of the nation you're in, it can be called Osage orange. It can be called hedge apple, bodark. It there's probably more that I don't know, but it's all talking about the same tree. Yet there's only one name for that species in Latin, and that's Maclura pomifera. So that's where we can really start to be able to talk the talk to each other and not get confused, especially if we're working with, in the case of the nursery, when you're working with small stock, some of the physical characteristics can be hard to tease out. Young tree bark doesn't look, and we'll talk about this more later, but young tree bark can trick you. It could look like a completely different species when it's older. So just something to be aware of. But that's a little bit on that. Any questions before we get into nomenclature? Because this is a good little break point, because now we're talking about something a little bit different.
Hey, Danny, we do have one question here.
Sure.
And sorry, I just had to reclaim host. I don't
No,
know
you're
if that
fine.
it doesn't seem to affect your functionality.
Okay.
So someone asked about I think it was Leaf Snap in particular, but ID apps in general, what your opinion is on those.
I'm glad you asked. I personally have found that they can mislead us a lot. I am not a fan. So I think that they can, and even myself, someone who I feel like I'm proficient in tree identification, if I leaf snap a leaf, which I have done, it throws out options that shouldn't even be on the table, because they shouldn't be found here. This, obviously, people bring in plants from all over the world, but it can, especially if you aren't able to use some of the methodology we'll get to and tease out physical characteristics, it can be very misleading. And then it also depends on how well you're able to get a photo of that leaf. Some of the serrations on a cherry leaf, it may or may not pick up very well, and it could throw you down the realm of an elm leaf, or it's a little too subjective in my book. So that's where I feel on that. From the standpoint of a key or something to go with, any reference book that you can find what's called a dichotomous key, where instead of just looking at a picture, you might have to have that leaf in front of you or that branch, and it'll be a series of yes or no questions, and that really helps. I think that helps a lot more than Leaf Snap. So call me old-fashioned, but that's kind of where I feel on that. So plant nomenclature, it just, as it states there, it's the naming of plants. We're going to move away from the classifying of plants, of how to classify groups of them, and make sense out of what we're looking at, but getting into a little bit of how we name plants. So the study of the science of naming them. And again, done in Latin, and it's just kind of what I said. Being able to have that scientific name goes a long way with being able to know what we're talking about with each other. It has the actual scientific name of a tree. It has 2 parts, the genus and species. Plus, you can tag on another epithet on the end for additional varieties. or cultivars. And that's where you'll see, sometimes you'll see an X or a VAR, and we'll talk about that a little bit, because, you know, depending on how you go about it, you think the tree we love to hate, which, you know, it's hard to hate a tree, but it's the tree that gets misplanted the most. Good old calorie pear, right? How many times do you hear, Bradford pear, calorie pear, aristocrat, all those different ones? They're all calorie pear trees, but they have been cloned. So calorie pear, for example, the genus would be Pyrus, and then the species Caloriana, and then any one of those ones you'd buy at a big box store, or hopefully not nurseries anymore, but you still can, would have an additional epithet on the end that would be an X, because it is a clone, really, or a cultivar. I don't want to confuse us here, but it's a clone of that original parents, of that original variety. So someone bred calorie pear against another pear stock and got the growth characteristics and flower characteristic that they wanted, and then every plant of that grew like that, say aristocrat, and it has a pyramid shape with white flowers at certain times, everyone after that was a genetic clone of that first variety. Okay, so it would be Pyrus Caloriana VAR aristocrat, that first one, because it was a variety. It happened naturally. Two plants were propagated together and they grew a certain way. So then that one is a variety. Makes sense? Clear as mud? Hopefully we can make more sense of it in some more slides. Here's just
Hey, Danny.
yeah.
We just had one question that's kind of related to that. I don't know if you're going to get to that, but someone just asked about the difference between a subspecies versus a cultivar.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I think I have a slide on that here shortly. If not, I'll make sure I address that. I'm going to write that down. So, all right. And we can talk about it, I guess, maybe even a little bit here. But it depends on what you always and this is a little, I understand you may not go around writing down scientific names, but it's important, so we'll talk about it. With you know, these trees here, you always have Acer saccharum. The Latin name is always italicized if you can. Obviously, we don't always write in italics, so they're underlined. The first word is capitalized, and the second word is not. And so that first example, that is how you would write out Acer saccharum, sugar maple. Now, a good example of something that the common name has a proper noun as the first word, you if you're writing it in English, you know, regular script, you would capitalize that, American elm, proper noun. But when you're writing the Latin, Ulmus Americana, doesn't need to be capitalized. It's just kind of how it is there. So then here's that example we're getting into of a variety, Gladitia triacanthus inermis. That is thornless honey locust, and it's written all as three words there, because the inermis is what dictates that it's the thornless variety. And that's where we can get into the, you know, a subspecies. I think what you may be referring to is more of like a variety. So that I would, you know, your thornless honey locust, your autumn blaze maple, or October glory, or what, you know, rather than use the word subspecies, I will use the word variety, because in this case here, thornless honey locust was not created by manually propagating two plants together of two different species. It did not take a black locust and a honey locust and propagate them together, or it didn't. These were basically, at some point in time, a group of honey locust trees bore seed, and that seed produced a thornless honey locust. That thornless honey locust seedling was then isolated, and then through finding more thornless honey locusts that came up, it was then naturally propagated on its own to keep creating a thornless variety. It's still a true honey locust. It still has happened naturally. It's just that this strain of genetics of this naturally occurring honey locust is now thornless. And so that's how that tree has entered the trade. Whereas a cultivar has been done with human intervention. Basically, a cultivar is going to be either a clone, or a cultivar is going to be a cutting off of one and propagated to another tree to be able to produce desired results. Does that make sense? So one is naturally occurring and one is not. And then the last one there, that's purple leaf plum. That's how you would write, a cultivar, something that's not naturally propagated. So again, italicized, but that's kind of that purple leaf plum. That Atropurpurea is what's the name that has been given, and it's capitalized and put in parentheses. I'm spending almost maybe too much time on this, but it's kind of it hit that point that someone brought up. Questions? Did it spur any more questions? All right.
I think you answered it.
All right, sounds good. So we'll move from there. We can set that aside, and we might even come back to it in some ways. I do want to make one point here, a little bit, and it's not a good visual, but just because this is where we were at. Something to think about when we deal with trees at forest relief versus trees we might find at a nursery that are those cultivars, is that when we're dealing with native trees, we are also dealing with, or native trees and shrubs, we're dealing with that other added benefit that we don't get so much with non-native species, and that is the ecological component, the benefit of the pollinators and the insects that are specialized on that given plant. So if I'm talking about, and we could, for the sake of conversation here, use aster as an example. The perennial aster, there are insects that are keyed in on the pheromone the pheromone that plant gives off, but also the color, the specific color of the flower, and the color of the different plant parts. And so when we breed varieties that have a completely different color, they appear and they look different to those pollinators, to those insects. So it's just an important point I wanted to hit on, is that when we, if our end goal, which I hope it isn't always, is to create a good environment, a good aesthetically pleasing environment around us, but also one that benefits the creatures and wildlife and the living world. It's important to be cognizant of the selections that we make. And I think I'll probably touch on that some more, plant selection, in the future. But I just wanted to touch on that for a minute.
Danny, someone did ask if all cultivars are less likely to be useful to native insects and birds.
No, it's kind of, I look at it as a sliding scale. It's not an absolute. If I have, purple dome aster, that it is not going to attract the pollinators that I want to attract. It just depends on what you're looking at and what the altered trait is. In the case of a purple dome aster, it's still that New England aster. It still has the same flower color. It still has most of those flowering characteristics intact. It's just been compacted. It's shrunken. And in fact, I have ones in my yard that I'm pretty sure I've cut them back down past where maybe there was an original graft or whatever the case is. But, well, not a graft. Sorry, I misspoke. But my point is, I've had sprouts, water sprout, or regrowth that has reverted back genetically. So that's the difference. Now there are some other, I don't have one on the top of my head, but there are some that are wildly different in color, and that's where you could run into some issues. So we'll move into identification, kind of the meat and potatoes of what we all came here for, I would guess. So again, we'll go through the process and some of the characteristics that plants have that we can really key in on and use to narrow down and move down in that proverbial funnel I described. We'll work through how leaf arrangement is very important and how it becomes a vital part of our thought process when we're identifying things. And then also we'll just touch on the leaf shapes and just some of the names for it. This presentation is made available, and so I'm not going to spend a lot of time again going through these little slides on the different leaf shapes, but just to help, it'll be more of a reference guide. I don't walking up to Mark and say, look at the apice on that leaf. We don't always talk like that, but it's good to know that when you are stuck with something and you're having to use a manual or a guide, those are the types of terms that will be used to be able to work through it. Again, I think we talked about this a little bit, and morphology is kind of that study of the size, shape, plant, and appearance of plants. One second. We use these things to help identify. I think we've hit that home a lot, right? Not just the leaves. We use everything. Some of the stuff you talked about in biology, which at least I hope you did. We use fall color. Obviously, certain trees, certain plants only have a certain fall color. And so that's fun. It can use it as a characteristic at that time of the year. But what about, winter, spring, summer, and fall? The form. That's a huge one. I think you talked about it, tree biology. When you get good at understanding X current versus D current, especially in the urban realm, you can do the drive-by tree ID and feel really cool and important. Oh, look at that vase-like shape. Oh, that's a D current tree. I bet you that's an elm. Look at that. That's huge. And that's the tree on the right. So it's kind of fun, kind of doing that. But then pin oaks and things like that, very pyramidal shape, those are your X current. You can think of the words X current gives that pyramidal shape, like a conifer or an oak tree. Not all oaks, but some. You do have to marry the knowledge of what tree grows at what shape to kind of be able to just do this out in the field. But things like that, like a elm, any fruit tree really is going to have that. I take the D from decurrent and I turn that hump up and put the flat side down, and now you have D for decurrent, and then you have that same shape of the rounded top there. So that helps when you're looking at different things. Fruit is huge again for that time of the year that you will come into seeing fruit. Anyone well, again, if we were in person, I'd be shouting out, anyone know what this is? But that's a sassafras. It's one of the I think most underrated fruits we have in Missouri. Tastes pretty good depending on when you get a good ripe one. The bark. Some trees, such as the one on the left, again, you can do the windshield identification.
Hey, Danny, you sure that was a sassafras?
Ah, ha, ha. Whoops. Sorry. Thanks, Mark. You
I
straightened
knew
me
that
out.
was just a little brain bubble there.
Pawpaw. Yeah, good old pawpaw. Sorry about that. It's like Missouri's custard. The tree on the left, that's a pine tree. No, I'm kidding. I'm just messing around because I screwed up once. No, it's it's trees like a sycamore. Yeah, it's very, I think we can all probably think back in our head even if you've never paid attention to tree identification, I think you've probably seen a big mature tree like this with flaking bark that is, white as a dried bone, and that's going to be a sycamore tree, or in the case of the arch grounds, a London plane tree as they get older. But still, you can narrow it down to two species. One is not from this country and one is. I think that really kind of is like an express route to identification in my book. The tree that the person's holding on to here, that's a really cool bark characteristic. One of my favorites, and I think a very underrated tree in the urban environment, and that's musclewood. Again, you say, oh, musclewood. Well, uh, what's another? Oh, guess what? Another common name, blue beech. So, it's it just varies so much, but its scientific name is Carpinus caroliniana. So there you go. There's no matter where you go in the world, if you mention Carpinus caroliniana, then people will know what you're talking about. But if you say blue beech, musclewood, yes, the name musclewood can help. You can see that there. The striations on the bark can really help to narrow down that that's what that is, because it's very unique, and I think it's a very cool feature. This is a really neat understory tree that can be used in the yard landscape, and it's an awesome tree for kids to climb on as it grows because it's really strong. The flowers, who doesn't love a good magnolia flower? But again, some trees flowers are very, very unique, and some even lend us to have the state flower be a tree. So in the case of flowering dogwood. Texture. This is I'm pretty sure I know Gruber's talks, and I know he quoted Alex Shigo, and I don't remember the exact quote, but you can't ID a tree from far away. You got to get up and touch it and feel it. You got to look at it up close and see the distinct texture that it has, because again, some trees are just so unique. You can know that texture on the bark, and you can almost stop there. Kentucky coffee tree is one very, very unique characteristic to it. Sugarberry and hackberry is another one. Again, think of hundreds of possibilities when you walk up to something, and just by simply knowing the unique bark texture that tree, those two trees possess, boom, you spit out down at the bottom, and you just have to determine, am I looking at a hackberry or a sugarberry? Both do grow in Missouri, and both will kind of overlap on where they would grow in the natural world, out in the wilderness. But when you really start to look at them, you can narrow it down a little bit. The twigs, you got the thorns there, and then also we'll get into some of the bud formations and the arrangement of a twig that can kind of help us see why knowing what the twigs look like is so important. And one species that we'll get to, that I think lends itself really well to winter ID, aside from that decurrent shape, is your elm trees. When you look up at a mature elm tree's twigs in the wintertime, as long as it's close enough for our eyes to discern it, you will see very distinct zigzag buds. I mean, the twig almost does a zigzag, and you'll see these fat buds, especially this time of year as we're approaching spring. It's really easy to identify. And then last but not least, if you really twist our arms, we'll talk about the leaves. It's the first thing everyone wants to go to, but there's a lot of other cool stuff to learn about first. Here's the makeup of a leaf. It's an important segue when we get into talking about the arrangement of the leaves on a twig, is that this is a simple leaf. Looks simple. You have a stem, you have a bud, you have a petiole, that first structure that branches off of the stem. And then you have the blade of the leaf, and that entire structure, that's where a lot of times just in talking points we can get mixed up, but that entire structure, from where it starts at the bud all the way to the tip of the blade, is considered the leaf. Now you might think, yeah, okay, I get it. I'm looking right at it. You don't have to keep telling me that. As you'll see when we get into a little bit more of some more complicated setups, it's important to understand what makes up a leaf versus a blade or a leaflet. Because this is a compound leaf. And you could probably think of some trees that you've seen that look like this. Anywhere from a honey locust to a walnut to a sumac. There are a lot of compound leaves out there. But again, this whole structure from the bud to the very tip of the tip leaflet, that is the leaf. Every little piece, every little, every little leaflet is not called a leaf. I know it can be confusing, especially when we start looking at it in the real world and you're trying to look up into a canopy and see what the heck you're trying to make sense of what you're looking at. But that whole structure is the leaf on a compound plant. And just to complicate it further, there's different types of compound leaves. There's pinnate, bipinnate, and palmate. One of the most common, and the cool part is, again, of the three here, the type of compound leaf that really helps you narrow down in that funnel of identification is if you can understand that buckeye or horse chestnut are one of the few trees you're going to come across here in Missouri, and especially in the St. Louis region, that are palmately compound. There's really nothing else that you're going to come across. Again, in the everyday environment, you go to the botanical garden or some sort of extreme greenhouse case, and you could see anything. But that really just drops you right down there to the very bottom, knowing that, oh wow, I see that palmate leaf. Okay, I'm dealing with buckeye out in the if I'm out in nature or at the nursery, or I'm dealing with horse chestnut, and that's a European tree that has been brought over here, and it's not invasive or anything like that. It's used a lot in horticulture industry, and it was used a lot more in earlier decades, but it's in the same family as buckeye. And so you can then narrow down, am I dealing with Ohio buckeye more than likely, or red buckeye? And those are the two Missouri natives that grow here. So again, that really helps narrow it down a lot. Then you have the different terms here. This is where I'm not going to spend a lot of time. We're not going to get into all the minutia, but just you can kind of guess here one of the more common leaf shapes that we really use and come across a lot, and that's lobed. Because whether it's oak, well, oak and maple are your more common lobed leaves, and there's a lot of oaks out there. But those are kind of the terms we use. And serrated or non-serrated, or serrated or entire, that's really some of the more common conversation that you'll have, is that leaf serrated. In guides, in leaf snap, knowing what a serrated leaf looks like versus undulate or entire are the margins. That's kind of the term. The leaf margins is the outer edge. Is it smooth? Is it entire? Or is it serrated? And then if it is serrated, then you get down into this with guidebooks on, okay, what does the serration look like? Fun fact though, I don't know if we'll get to it. Again, I'd like to throw the question out, are all oaks lobed? And no, they're not. I mean, again, we're just for sake of Zoom, I'll keep going here, but they're not. Shingle oak is one that can throw you for a loop when you're getting into this in the beginning stages, because it's a fairly common tree in our suburban landscape, because it was an old field tree. It's kind of what we call early successional, but it has actually an entire leaf with a bristle tip on the end versus the typical oak leaf that is lobed. And it can kind of throw folks off for a minute because it has bark that looks just like a pin oak, but a leaf that is nothing like a pin oak. So nature's always throwing us little curveballs. Here's what you call the apice and the base, the top and the bottom of the leaves. Just again, I'm not going to spend really any time here because this is all stuff that as you really have to pull a leaf and get into what am I dealing with, then this is where you're going to start going down like a dichotomous key. It may say something like, does it have an obtuse apice, or does it have a round base, or yes or no, and then you move down to the next question. So just understanding what it is. Really, lobes are important. You have lobes, and then the projecting segment. So the segment of these leaves that look like a finger, and then just like, and then what you call the cavity in between is the sinus, just like the sinuses on our nose. So you have the lobes and the sinuses, and that's talked about in a lot of regularity, and it can help with identification. The leaf arrangement is what I really want to get to here, because this is one of those things, if you leave here with nothing else other than understanding some of the, X current, D current, some of the key morphological things to look at, but really leaf arrangement, this is where you really start. This is pretty awesome, because this can really make sense of things for you. If you can combine leaf shape and the leaf arrangement, you can really narrow things down. So you have alternate is the most common way things that leaves would be arranged on a twig. Think of a ladder. Think of that elf on a shelf that everybody puts up in the wintertime. It's climbing the rungs of a ladder. No one necessarily climbs a ladder like this, hopping up a ladder. Those buds on an alternately arranged twig are going to have a bud on one side, and then ladder step up on the other opposite side of the twig. The bud will be on the other side with a segment in between. Okay. The second most common that we'll come across is opposite, and you see down on that photo that those buds, while they still are opposite of each other on the stem, they are not ladder stepped up. There is no segment of growth in between those buds. They are directly across from each other on the twig. So that's opposite. And that's your things like your maples, your ash, your dogwood, then your alternate are things like your oak, your hickory. There's a huge amount of alternately arranged trees. And then you also have world, which I'm blanking out on an example of a world arrangement, Mark, if you have one off the top of your head.
Catalpa.
Well, yeah, catalpa. There you go. Yeah.
It's the only one I can think of, honestly.
No, yeah. So again, that's something you may not come across a lot anymore, but catalpa used to be fairly common in the urban environment. And if you can, there used to be called the cigar tree for a reason. Those big old seeds that were, as long as, if not longer than a big Cuban cigar. But if those are gone and you look at it and you see a world structure to it, you're basically looking at catalpa. So you just short circuited that whole system of questioning through this funnel that I keep hitting. But the mnemonic device that I hope you leave here with that can help you in everyday life working on this stuff is called Mad Buck. Some say Mad Horse or Mad Cap, but just remember, everything is mad. Maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye. That's the most, that describes the most common oppositely arranged trees you will come across. The other one, Mad Horse, because I talked about horse chestnut. And the one I really like to use, because there's, this also helps to identify bush honeysuckle, which doesn't take much once you've seen it. It's etched in your brain until you die. But Caprifoliaceae is the family that the invasive honeysuckles fall under. So Mad Cap is what I like to use. Maple, ash, dogwood, Caprifoliaceae, or maple, ash, dogwood, buckeye. So again, you walk up to a plant or to a tree, you're at the top of the funnel, and you say, all right, is it alternate or oppositely arranged? Well, it's alternate. Crud. I still have hundreds of options. It's opposite. Hey, I'm in Missouri. I'm in the St. Louis area. I see some leaves there. They're lobed. Lobed leaves, oppositely arranged. I'm pretty okay. Simple leaf. One leaflet on that one petiole coming off the bud. Okay, I'm thinking I'm at maple, or all right, I'm standing up next to this tree It's oppositely arranged. All right, good. I narrowed it down. Okay, it's a simple leaf, um, but um, but it's a simple leaf and has a simple structure. It's not compound. Okay. Well, and I'll tell you some other things, but it's a dogwood. Okay, great. There's other things we would look at. But then ash is going to be compound. So that's, again, if you can get to opposite, then you just ask yourself a couple more questions. You can really get a little further in the identification. Any questions?
No, we don't have anything yet. So.
Okay, sounds good. So this is just, we kind of hit this pretty hard, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. But again, this just further describes the leaf arrangement definitions. And conifer foliage. I was wondering if anybody was thinking, hey, are they going to get to this? But conifer foliage, it's different but the same. I mean, the needles are the leaves of the tree, so it's not anything too crazy to think about, other than that you start to characterize them by the number of needles in a bundle. Excuse me, things like the bottom right, that's Colorado blue spruce. It's going to have a single needle coming right off of the twig, and whereas something like white pine up on the top left will be in a bundle, and while it's not exact, you'll see things like bundles of 4 to 5. Well, white pine needles are going to be long, fairly flexible, and always be in bundles of 4 to 5. So that can help you narrow it down when you're looking at pine trees, especially what we luck out in, that not a lot of pine trees really grow well in St. Louis. There's no native pine trees to St. Louis region. Not till you get further south of Missouri will you encounter the lone native pine in Missouri, shortleaf pine, Pinus echinata. But in the urban environment, you're going to see white pine, Austrian pine, up there on the top right. If you can make it out there in the photo, you'll see there are bundles of 2, and they're pretty long. Scotch pine is also going to be in a smaller bundle count, but you'll have a lot shorter needles than Austrian pine. So then you can kind of tease it out a little bit further. That's where, again, guidebooks will help come into play, because we don't, you'll encounter far less evergreens than you will deciduous trees. So you don't have to be as good with it, but it is kind of nice to know. And Scotch pine also will have very, as it gets larger, it'll have orange tint to the bark as it grows. So that helps as well. But that's kind of what I wanted to hit on there with conifer foliage, unless we get more questions as we go. And on to winter tree ID, the real fun part. This is where you can really activate the additional senses, in that sometimes you got to get up there and take a bite out of a tree. You might think I'm crazy, but really, seriously, something like sassafras there, that photo of the whole bare plant. Sassafras has that very distinct, not only does it have a distinct smell to the leaves when you crush it, some say it smells like Fruit Loops cereal, but the twig, I mean, a lot of folks like to, myself included, like to break a little twig off when I'm walking and chew on it for a little while when you're walking through the woods, because it has a very distinct taste, and it's not a bad taste to it, but there's really nothing else like it. Along the lines of smell, if you've ever encountered ailanthus tree or tree of heaven, which is an invasive species that we see, it's an exotic species of tree that can take over, but we see it a lot in urban environments. It's kind of that forgotten landscape that just, alleyways and things like that. We see it a lot, but it has a very distinct smell to it. And if you were to break one of its pieces off, a lot of folks think it smells like peanut butter. And I think I go with that. Something like pith The pith is, which again, doubling back onto something we've learned. The pith is the center of a twig. It's the heartwood of a twig. And the pith, on one species in particular, if you can kind of learn some of the little key features, will get you right to it, is that if you can reach a twig on a young walnut or even an old walnut that has a fallen dead branch, and you can break it open or cut into it longitudinally, slice long ways on that and get into the pith, you'll see these chambers. And those chambers are, then I'm dealing with a walnut. That's what it is. It's just a characteristic. I don't know if we've gotten to a specific reason why this plant has adapted to that. But if you see that, you're dealing with a walnut. If you have a large walnut and you think it might be, and you are able to just kind of chunk some of that old bark off and it's still chocolatey colored underneath, you're dealing with a walnut. But that's where, unfortunately, I do like to do this class when we can, typically we'll meet in person and meet at Forest Park or meet somewhere where we're talking through some of this, but we're also walking and we're talking about specific little items as we go. So, I'm getting towards the end of the presentation, and I don't want to bore folks by just going through pictures of trees, but I'm certainly open to that as we go. We'll double back on that here in a minute. But more with winter tree ID, and I think this goes for any time of the year. When you're dealing with ash trees, specifically, you can really see how these bud scars, they call them bud scars, they're very unique, because sometimes ash trees can fool you, because a green ash looks very similar to a white ash. In the natural, if you're out on a conservation area or something, they'd be grown on two different spots in the landscape. But in the urban environment, they could be planted next to each other. And that's where, if you can begin to look at the bud scars, you can see that a white ash is going to be, you see it down here in the bottom. For some reason this doesn't show green ash, but white ash is going to look more like that D turned on its side, where green ash is going to have a more C or crescent shape to it. It's going to be very extreme. The bud will be nestled down underneath these what are called bundle scars. And so you can really tell the difference between a green ash and a white ash if you're able to take a look at these, at the leaf scar. So that's an important part there. And again, this is where, once you become a true tree nerd, winter ID becomes real fun, because you can, again, snip a twig off with pruners, and you can come back to where you're at and key it out and go through and look at the bud shapes and colors and all the fun stuff, and end up with like, oh, that's what I was dealing with. Cool. Now I know in the dead of winter I can figure that out. Another thing is, I don't have it pictured here, but on hickories, in Missouri, we have a lot of different hickories, and I'll double back to that Missouri oak and hickories guide. But within the 20 to 30 hickories you might come across, more like 20, I think, you might come across in Missouri. The bud shapes are very distinct. Something like bitternut hickory is going to have this sulfur colored slender bud, and it's bright and it's really neat looking. And I just like to look for it when I'm looking at hickories. But regardless of the amount of leaflets on a leaf, because it's compound, that bud is going to be the giveaway on that hickory. So just kind of some neat things. Again, just things to focus in on. And I will point out that this bottom book here, this guide, A Key to Missouri Trees in Winter, we do not publicate it anymore, but I have one that I'll short circuit our own publications department. I have one that I digitized. So, I you may just have to catch me on the street, and I'll get you a digital copy. But it's a really helpful guidebook because it has some good keys in it, and but the other one there, fruit key and twig key, is pretty good as well. But just to double down, like as I've said, these identification keys or dichotomous keys can be very useful because they're those yes or no questions, and rather than depending on a computer that has no nuance of what is actually happening on that site and doesn't know the factors of what it's looking at, it's just looking at a leaf. You're putting a lot of stock in just the computer algorithm of knowing what a leaf on a photo is. It helps. It could get you in the vicinity if you're able to say tease out a list of 4 and know that 1 or 2 of the 4 are not even are exotic or don't grow in this state. And then you're like, okay, well, all right, maybe it's, you know, sycamore versus London plane tree, you know. But when you get into things like your ornamental species, like all of the ornamental cherries, Kwanzan cherry, you know, all that kind of things, it's the differences can be so, they may not show up well on a photo. That's the other thing I caution. So and even then, even with our human eyes, some of the ornamental tree species, it can be pretty difficult because, you know, especially look at all the maples in the world. You walk up to red sunset, autumn blaze. Well, through using this process, you're going to get to, hey, you know what? That has 3 lobes that are pretty tight together. They're smaller leaves compared to, oh, there's a silver maple over there. Compared to that tree, it's different. It's smaller leaves and their 3 lobes look more like a turkey foot. Oh, I'm dealing with a red oak. Yeah, you are. I'm sorry, red maple. In its true form, it's a red maple. But any of the varieties or cultivars underneath of it, it can be difficult to discern just by using this simple process if you don't know where it's sourced from. So that is all I have for the formal presentation. So like I said, I'm completely open to just riffing off questions and or pulling up some photos of different plants, because this is where we would typically be doing a walkabout and address any like ways to apply this. I didn't quite come up with a good way to mimic being outdoors. So I'll open it up to the floor here.
Danny, we do have 2 questions from chat. One, someone asked about a walnut with yellow buds. I thought maybe they're thinking of butternut. As I recall, butternut might have yellow buds.
Yeah, I think yes, that's where I would go with that. Yes. So in Missouri, you will come up with, you know, a native species is butternut, and it is in the walnut family, but unfortunately, it's been subjected to a blight, so that a disease has really knocked it back over the last 100 years or so. So you'll come across it far less than you used to, but it's pretty valuable timber, and it's a pretty desirable tree when you do find a good mature one. Folks would be interested in it.
And another one, in this one, I mean, I still find difficult. How do you visually tell the difference between a sycamore and a London plane tree?
Yeah, as Mark as Mark said, I mean, we all, yeah, I get there as well. And I'll be honest, I don't want to mislead you on anything, because what I was taught and what I use isn't always easy to do depending on the time of the year, and that's the number of seeds of fruit. I'm sorry, the number of fruit that are hanging off of the tree. And again, it's a guideline. It's not perfect. These are two species that are very closely related. And so I will say, I believe sycamore typically will have 2 fruit hanging. And Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but plane tree can more often have just 1. Am I wrong there?
I think you're right. I mean, the fact that neither one of us knows for
Yeah,
sure is a
yeah,
testament to the fact that even people that do this for a living can't necessarily. And yeah, a lot of it, I mean, if you see it in the woods when you're on a hike, it's a sycamore. You know, if you see it planted on a street, it's kind of harder to tell. There's a much better chance it's gonna be a plane tree. But yeah, that's one that it still kills me. And the anthracnose that sycamore gets,
Yeah.
unfortunately, can be kind of an identifying feature.
Yeah, very true. Yeah, the plane tree is a little less susceptible to that. So if we're in the heart of the spring, and you have a sycamore tree in your neighborhood or something that is a sycamore, and like Mark said, if it has this anthracnose fungus, which causes them to drop their leaves, not long after they've leafed out for the year. But then you say you go down to the arch grounds, which we know has plane trees that have been recently planted there, and you see these trees that look like sycamore and they have full leaf still. Odds are you're probably looking at plane tree, like Mark said.
We
And
had
Mark,
an
go ahead.
oh, we just had another question too. Someone asked about different trees that have catkins. Someone else mentioned birches and willows. I know there's other ones. Doesn't alder have catkins?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, alder does. And that, again, there you go. That's another very good. I'm glad you brought that up because I didn't put that in the slide. But it's a good identifying characteristic, depending on the time of the year. Again, it wouldn't be useful in the winter, but could obviously be very useful in the spring, of knowing what you're looking at, because it can help narrow it down. And both those last 2 points also solidify, if you can have you don't have to be an avid hiker or a woods person to just take a few minutes to even just head out to a county park or anywhere with some natural space and try and do some ID out there. Because when you're doing your identification out there, you can also work on what will be a future presentation of is understanding tree selection and why certain trees grow where they grow, because that knowledge can help narrow it down for you out in the woods. You won't necessarily see mockernut hickory growing right down along a creek bank, but you'll see it up on a drier, rockier site. And you'll more likely see shagbark hickory down low right off of a drainage, and you won't likely see it up high. So you can start to tell bur oak. The bur oak and white oak both have rounded lobe leaves. They won't grow typically in the same site. Bur oak would be right down there in a floodplain like at Forestry Leaf, whereas if you head up the hill of Creve Coeur Lake Park up towards subdivisions and crest, mid slope or crest the top of the slope, that's the heart of where white oak would typically grow. So there, as you're moving around on the landscape, you can kind of just become observant and stop and look, and it can give us answers as to why we plant certain trees where we do in the urban environment. And it can also help us think through, should I plant this post oak in this low-lying spot in my backyard that collects a lot of water? Well, if we can think it through, probably not, because post oak grows on a thin rocky soil on the very top of a summit, and we're wanting to put it in a condition that it would have no oxygen and be flooded, so it wouldn't do well. That makes sense.
Danny Meredith actually had a great suggestion here to maybe discuss a few common trees that are often confused, kind of like plane tree and sycamore. Just because I feel
Sure.
like that's a big kind of stumbling block for people starting out with ideas, that there are a lot of those trees where, I mean, even two people that have been doing this for
Yeah.
years and years
Can
have
you
trouble
guys
with it.
can folks see my screen still? Because I'm just gonna go to the internet here. Green ash versus white ash. We'll start there because I can hopefully get us an image that describes what I was talking about. We'll try and get a good one. And I will use this to caution too. The Google can be a very powerful tool, but boy, it can lead you down hours of frustration if you,
Danny, hold
again,
on. I think I need to make you host again, I think, so you can
okay,
change what you're sharing. Give me 1 second here because we're still just
yep,
seeing the presentation.
okay.
All right, there you go.
Does it work now?
You are the host. Yeah.
Okay, and did it change? Because I think I changed it too. Okay, so what we're seeing here is, as I was describing, your green ash has that very distinct crescent shape, and white ash will have that more D-shape leaf scar, and that can be confused a lot, because I'm going to try and back out here and show you just the two trees, and it's like, oh, well, they do look kind of similar here. We're going to what else we got? So yeah, there. I mean, you can see here this photo that my cursor is over. You can go off the leaf shape of green ash and white ash, but it's not as easy as being able to look at that that leaf scar, and the bark of an ash tree in general isn't that different between the two. I think the next one we'll go to would be, see that, and this is another to get us into some of that good winter ID, tree ID stuff. If you look at the bark of this ash tree here, one of the things that I liken this to is like the diamond plate metal. They call it diamond plate, but it's like a truck toolbox or something. But it has these are called striations, and the pattern of ash is very distinct, and how these striations appear as the tree gets older. They start to weave themselves together, I think, in a diamond-like pattern as you look up the trunk. And so, again, when you start to put it all together, you see this large tree. Okay, it has this diamond plate, or this certain striation to it. And then you look up and see that the silhouette of it up against the sky is oppositely arranged. And then you happen to see that on leaf on times that it's a compound leaf. It's opposite, it's compound, and it has this kind of distinct, I call diamond plate bark. You've arrived at an ash tree. Whether or not you get down to the minutia, you've arrived at an ash tree. And we may not have to worry about this. Well, we won't have to worry about this too much in the future. We'll be looking at a lot of scraggly ash trees that we can very easily see the leaf scars. But because of emerald ash borer, if you haven't been familiarized with that yet. Mark, I was thinking, what, bald cypress versus dawn redwood? What was this? Do like the tree showdown? What do you think?
Yeah, someone actually just asked about that. Yeah, I would cover that one. Sorry, this is weird. Whenever I try to unmute myself, I have to steal the host function from you.
No worries.
But yeah, it looks like it's working again for you. So
I don't know if we'll find a good photo, but one really, just stepping back from the first level of identification is, again, having a good sense or awareness of place. If you're in the built environment, and you're in a formalized setting, you may be dealing with both. But if you're out in the natural environment, dawn redwood is from Asia, and it's a very old species, and it does do well here. But dawn redwood does not escape planting. And so you're not going to see it out in the woods. So if you are in, especially if you're traveling down to South Missouri, that where bald cypress naturally occurs. But even out in our region here, there's conservation plantings and things that you'd see bald cypress as a tree. But sorry, I'm trying to find one of the two next to each other. But dawn redwood will have more of this large X-current shape. That one that had full, there we go. Let's go with that. That is a good photo of dawn redwood. You more than likely will have, I'm sorry, the X-current shape. So we'll more than likely have a peak. And so you're standing back. Hey, I like to use Bellefontaine Cemetery because you'll in North St. Louis, you'll come into contact with both trees, and they'll both be massive because they're old, and it's a really cool place to go look at trees. But you'll see the top, and you'll see the full shape of these large dawn redwood trees, and you're going to see it be more pyramidal, okay? Whereas bald cypress is a lot more likely to have a little bit more of a decurrent shape. It may look a little bit more, and it also naturally won't have as many limbs all the way to the ground. It's you can look at it and be like, yeah, I'm looking at the same tree, but no, it's hard to say there. And then I can't, Mark, you remember a more distinct morphological characteristic?
Dawn redwood is opposite.
There you go. Thank you.
Someone else just also, I'd never heard it put this way. She said dawn redwood has armpits, which I thought was a hilarious way of putting it.
Okay.
I've always thought of it as it looks like someone just like jammed a branch into the trunk.
Yes.
I don't know if you can find a picture that displays that.
Let's see. Oh, there's. Let's see if that's what we're talking about. Kind of a little bit. You can kind of see it there where it almost looks like it's like jammed into the muscle of a tree almost. That's not the case, but I get it. The fruit too. So the fruit of a dawn redwood will look like this. They're going to be a little more pine cone like. They won't be as tight. You'll be able to see some air in between. So that's a good giveaway that you're looking at dawn redwood. When you're looking at bald cypress, it's going to be more of look like a little ball. See, it's very tight. So that's another real good giveaway between the two. They're both cool, awesome trees. And that's one thing. There's some awesome non-native trees that aren't invasive. I feel like this day and age, we tend to want to say all non-native trees are horrible, but they're not. Or we don't say that, but I'm just saying we're all about natives, and natives are amazing because of those added ecological benefits. But a tree like dawn redwood is pretty cool too. What's another one you could think of, Mark?
Someone asked about northern red oak and pin oak, which
there you go, good one.
Be a real doozy.
All right, we'll start with pin oak because it's easy to make. It's easy to pick on. It's got some great characteristics that set it apart. So if you're looking at pin oak, here's a good example. Pin oak, especially open grown, it's going to have, no matter how much you limb up the branches, no matter how high you cut up the limbs, one of its distinct characteristics on its general shape is that it's going to grow these long drooping limbs that'll hang down towards the ground. as you talked about in tree biology, they're trying to get up and become that central leaf and exude apical dominance. But just the natural way that pin oak grows, it just droops down towards the ground. And then, while I can't necessarily zoom in on this too much, as you look up, if you're standing up next to that trunk looking up into the canopy, it will be very, for lack of a better word, very messy. You will have a lot of small twigs and branches coming off of each branch, but then along the trunk, you will have a lot of small growth. It will be very clogged as you're looking up. It's a very full and kind of what I call messy oak tree. A lot of sprouts. It will just kind of exude that. That's its natural tendency, likely because of growing in the floodplain. It had to really kind of keep growing, or it's going to die because of flooding. Covering up its roots and everything. So it's always putting on as much leaf area as possible. On contrary, northern red oak, get my bar to light up here. Whoops. Is a much more open form canopy. The leaves are different too. I'll get into the leaves here in a minute. But I want to start with kind of that far away view and then get up into the canopy itself. But northern red oak, while you're going to look at some of these and say, I'm not sure I know what you're talking about. Here's a good example. As this tree gets larger and larger, it's going to have a better tendency to drop its inner branches and cut them off and not give them energy, because it's a little bit more efficient of a tree because it has to conserve a little bit more of its energy given where it grows. So it won't have as much smaller growth up into the inner canopy, and we'll have more of your leaf area out here on the outer portion. And it also is a lot less tendency to sag and droop. So that's the far away. Then we'll look at the bark, and then we'll go to the leaves. Pin oak bark is very tight, as I like to call it. Those striations is a term that we use. It doesn't have very defined striations. It doesn't stack up and create real defined ridges, and it's a very tight, flat bark. And it will, to me, look a little silvery as you kind of look at it. And it will be, this is probably taken right at about eye level, because more often than not, as you move up a mature pin oak tree, it will get smoother and more shiny or silvery. And then at eye level or a little above, somewhere around there or lower, it's going to have a more kind of like blockiness to it. I'd keep going on photos, but I'll probably spend time wasting time looking at photos we don't want to see. But this is that where it's kind of a little blockier down low. That's a good, so these are, and then when you go to northern red oak bark and you look up into it, or Quercus rubra, as we've learned on some Latin terms here, you're going to have more defined striations. This is a good one here. And as you look up into it, I like to call them ski slopes. You'll really start to see it as you look up into the canopy, that the ridges of the striation will kind of cascade, down or up, vertical, and like one seems to flow into another and down and down, and that can help be a dead giveaway. It's a pretty defining characteristic of red oak, I feel, is that what we call ski slope. There it is on another small tree. And then finally, we'll go to the leaves. Let's see if I can get a side-by-side and save us some time. This is where that Missouri Oaks and Hickories guide comes in handy because it shows all of this right on the same pages, right next to each other. Yeah, this helps. Pin oak leaf is going to have a very narrow body to it, whereas look at northern red oak here. Look at that. It's a very wide leaf. You can see the sinuses on both. And then you can see the cavities, the sinuses, and then you can see the lobes on both. They're pretty different when you stack them up. Pin oak is very distinct in that it's going to have, you know, about six, maybe seven, well, 6 to 7 lobes, and northern red oak is going to have a lot more. And almost, I like to say top heavy. It will have more of these lobes towards the end of the leaf than pin oak does. And one thing too to notice on any trees, but oaks in particular, it can be tricky when you're looking at large trees on the landscape because the lowest leaves that we see are what's called the shade leaves, in that on any given tree, the leaves might be different sizes. So it's hard to go off of, oh, well, this leaf is really small and that one's really big alone, because that northern red oak leaf you're seeing here, I would guess this was probably came off of the bottom part of the canopy, because remember how trees have to compete and produce energy. They need as much sunlight as they can for photosynthesis. Well, the leaves down low are further away from sunlight, so they have to produce more surface area to be able to keep producing energy. And remember, each branch is somewhat autonomous. It functions on its own. So it's not that the tree itself is saying you leaves down low need to grow larger. It's that branch itself knows to outcompete the rest of the tree, I need to produce larger leaves to take in more sunlight to produce more energy. And so the leaves down low are usually going to be larger than the leaves up top in a tree. So that's where sometimes it can be good to look at the bottom of a tree and see some of those leaves on the ground and help maybe use them to get in the ballpark. But you don't want to just rely on that, because a black oak leaf can be similar in size to a red oak leaf. I'm going to take a drink and let me know if there's any questions.
As far as just some good books that could help people out with this, do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. I think there's 2 paid books, you know, 2 books that, you know, we have some of those free publications I mentioned, and those are pretty good to start with. But there's Trees of Missouri. Is it Bill Kerr, I think? Trees of Missouri and Shrubs of Missouri are 2 pretty good publications. Yeah, Don Kerr's, that's it. And you know, we sell Trees of Missouri typically on our ebook store, but that's a really good one, because it'll have some color drawings and sketches along with a lot of information that we covered here. It has some good keys in it. There's Shrubs of Missouri. If you're feeling real ambitious, there's a guy named Michael Durr, if anyone's familiar. He's kind of like the guy in the terms of plant taxonomy and stuff. But it's a hefty book, and it probably isn't cheap. But it's pretty cool. Yeah, he's got many different books. I can't remember what is on. That's it. The Woody Manual of Woody Lance. Yeah, that's like
probably going to be like about $100.
Yeah. But I really think that there's no.
Book.
It is. It really is. And Anywhere, especially the fun part is once you get into the methodology, any like national park visitors center or anywhere you go around the country to travel, there's usually a visitors center that will have a tree book for that region. And it can really add to the vacation experience when you can just grab one of those and go out and walk. Oh, wow, that's a cool, okay. Oh, that's rock maple. Oh, okay, cool. I've never seen that here. Or the different kinds of birch trees that are out there and all kinds of stuff. So the sky's the limit, really. But yeah, the trees of Missouri, I think, would be the good next step above a free publication.
And yeah, some of those like Durr's book has, I mean, it has all kinds of stuff you're never gonna see in Missouri. And if you're gonna
Yeah.
try to carry that around like a park or something with you, you're
Yeah.
gonna have to put it in a backpack because
Yeah.
otherwise you're gonna have a real unpleasant walk. It's a
Yeah.
it's a
And
huge book.
for sure. And it can end up being more confusing than it's worth. But the 50 common trees, that's free. It's black and white, but it's because it's free, you can grab a few when you're at one of our areas, and you won't feel bad if you lose it. If you drop it or something happens to it, you can always get another one. Of course, it's not coming up, but it's in the presentation. And let's see what we got here. And also, we while we're on the internet, we have a field guide on our website. I think, not to toot our own horn or anything, but I think it's pretty good. Right there at the top, all I did was go to trees and plants, and you can go to field guide, and then we try to do a pretty good job of different things to look for as the flowering season, as trees are greening out and we start to get into our spring flowering trees and stuff. We'll start to post things to look for, kind of like I'm pretty sure that you guys do at the nursery on the dry erase board. But yeah, there we go. And this is what you'll see in that Trees of Missouri book or the 50 Common Trees is different drawings like this. But we'll get into, it can help be on the fly. And I've had pretty decent luck with this, saving this page to my home screen on my smartphone. That's pretty technically advanced for me. But it seems to work pretty well. And then while we're here, because we got a few minutes, I will say, once you become a real tree nerd and you can identify trees with the snap of a finger, you're obviously going to want to look for the biggest ones of any tree that you'll find. And we got you covered because, your very own Mark Halpin, he has a current state champ tree to his name. The state champion witch hazels in Forest Park, and he found it. And but we recognize the largest trees of any native species in Missouri. So it's kind of fun recognition program. You get, if you nominate it, you get a plaque. The nominator gets a plaque. The tree's owner gets a plaque. And then if it's large enough, it gets added to the list. If it's on public property, it gets mapped out and folks can go visit it. If it's not, well, then, we won't publish that. But we score it out, and it's really cool to see the Ohio Buckeye here. I'm not going to say where it is, other than it's in Clayton in a residential backyard. I mean, this tree is, like you'll see there, the height is 81 feet tall, and that was verified with, like, we measure it with a laser, but it's like the coolest buckeye I've ever seen. 81 foot tall, and when you start to find these trees, you start to recognize what buckeye will grow, how buckeye grows. You really won't, like a forestry leaf buckeye that comes out of the nursery and gets plopped into a yard or an open space. It may not reach 30 feet tall in its life. So the fact that this one's 81 feet tall is pretty amazing. I can probably find the photo somewhere. We also have a virtual tour, so it's kind of cool. So it's fun, and also on that note, you never know what tree you plant or what tree comes out of forest relief or anywhere might become a state champion, because the state champion plum, which I'll just show you. Let's see. Because it'd be a good ID type conversation. What's a good one? If you don't know the species, you might be like, oh, it's not that big. But American plum or wild plum, that's a Missouri native species that will typically not grow more than maybe 15, maybe 20 feet tall. And it really doesn't spread out like to what, like a quarter of that. It may not, the typical silhouette of a wild plum, maybe like that. So the fact that this tree is as wide as it is pretty amazing. But this is a really cool tree species that I like to recommend, and this is a little bit of selection talk, but it's a very good replacement for calorie pear because it's native, but it's spring flowering and all kinds of critters like it. And it also is it has enough showiness to be a good yard ornamental tree, but but still have some good survivability to it because it typically grows on just about any site. But yeah, this one was pretty amazing. And the fact that it came from the Department of Conservation 30 plus years ago, and this guy plopped it in his backyard, and now it's the biggest one we know of. So it's kind of cool. But I hope we have more big tree hunters. We need it's fun to get out, and it's fun to do in groups, I think.
Hey Danny, we had one other question that is a good one about someone asked how ginkgo is classified.
Sure.
And it's the true probably the oddest tree taxonomically you're going to see around here, at least.
For sure. Let's go back to the internet. So ginkgo is, believe it or not, another one of those deciduous conifers in the fact that you see that fan-shaped leaf and you think, oh, that's just a tree leaf. No, it's more than that. That is actually compressed needles. Which is pretty amazing. I feel like there's a reason it's one of the oldest living tree species, because it's really cool how it's adapted. And I don't specifically know why it's adapted this way, but this one doesn't quite do justice. But as you look, there you go, perfect. These are a series of compressed needles that have grown together to form the shape of a simple leaf, but it in fact is the needles. And then let's see if we can get the fruit. They look like fruit, and they can have a bit of a fleshiness to them, but they are considered a cone. Just like Eastern red cedar, people will call those berries, but they really are just they're a cone. So, so yeah, it's kind of an anomaly in that it's a cone bearing tree that does lose its leaves. So kind of like along the lines of bald cypress. Does that make sense? But yeah, it's a pretty cool one.
Someone asked about, does the fruit have a particular smell for ginkgo?
Why don't you answer that, Mark?
Yeah, I mean, it's famous for just it produces butyric acid, which also gives like vomit and ripe cheese. It's distinctive smell. So yeah, you're gonna know if you're around a male ginkgo in the fall.
Yeah, so that's where you remember the very beginning we talked about having an understanding of identifying tree species to know how to care for them. Also, you have to be able to understand some of the nuances within tree species, because you don't want to plant the wrong sex of a tree and you will get especially in the environment of working in a public space or planting in a park, you will hear from the public about it for sure. But yeah, I mean that wraps up the basics of what I typically would cover. That's all I got, folks.
Yeah, and Danny, I definitely got to say, I think this is, of all the topics we're covering, this is probably the hardest to do virtually, because I mean, you can look at pictures and you
Right.
did an excellent job of going into, the theory and the methodology of tree ID, but to actually learn how to identify trees, there's only one way to do it, and that's outside, walking around, looking at trees and touching them and smelling them and tasting them. You just got to interact with them. So,
For sure.
but it is, I mean, as you said, I think that the funnel you were talking about is a perfect analogy. You just have to narrow things down. But once you learn the technique, it's really a matter of you just have to go out there and look at trees that are actually growing outside. So I think you did a great job of giving people those kind of basic tools to start that process. But
Cool.
everyone, it's getting nice outside, go outside and look at trees out there, because that's the only way you're going to figure this stuff out.
For sure. That's some good homework, isn't it? Boy, go look at trees. That's rough. That's rough.
And yeah, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So yeah, unless you have anything else to say, yeah, like I said, I think that was a really great job of introducing people to the basic method of it, and a lot of the terminology they're going to encounter.
Okay.
So
cool. Well, I think this hopefully popped back up on the screen. But all I'll say is if you are working through something in your yard or whatever you're doing and you have you're really stumped, aside from Mark and Forest Relief, who obviously you can reach out to, but myself, I'm another resource. That's part of my job, is to field public calls and help assist with tree questions as I can. So there's my email. So as you're working through things and you really get stumped, give me a holler. So thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
great. Thank you, Danny. Really appreciate it. So next week, same time, we're going to cover soils with Hank Stelzer from the University of Missouri Extension. So hopefully we'll see everyone next week at 6. I'll send out a follow-up email with the PDF of Danny's presentation here and some other goodies to keep you going until next time. So yeah, with that, I guess I'll just say good night, everyone. Thanks again, Danny, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.